terms of supply for the global maize balance, we just seen that production is sharply up this year, plus 40 million tonnes. And it's combined with ample stocks at the beginning of the crop year. On the demand side, we have maximized the feed use at the expense of barley and wheat, so sharp increase in feed demand. This means higher import needs of several countries. We will see that later. But despite all this assumption, stocks should remain comfortable at the global level. Firstly, import needs. I said that imports should rise in several countries. So here in this graph, you see the difference between imports of last year and what our forecast for this year. So for the EU, we forecast plus 3 million tonnes in imports. This means 21 million tonnes of imports from third countries in Europe. It's a record ever. It's a really high number. Then, in Asian countries, as feed demand will rise, we forecast an increase, for example, in South Korea, in Vietnam, also in China. And in Mexico, we also forecast higher import needs due to higher feed demand, but also higher food demand. This means that global trade is expected to rise by 10 million tonnes at the global level. So who will supply this rise in demand? If we look at competitiveness, here it's a graph showing an example of maize delivered North Africa. You see on the bottom of the chart, it's in yellow, and you've got Ukrainian maize. In green, you've got Bulgarian and Romanian maize prices. So you see that these origins are really competitive. And if we do the same chart for Asia, it's quite the same price pattern. So Ukraine is the most competitive origin on the global market, followed by Bulgarian and Romanian maize, and then US. On the contrary, here in blue, you've got French prices, which are out of the market. The consequence on that is we forecast a really high number of exports from Ukraine, so plus here Ukraine, plus 5 million tonnes compared to last year. We have maximized the level of export from this country due to the good competitiveness, and you will see later that supply and demand in Ukraine is just balanced. We also forecast higher exports from Brazil, nearly plus 3 million tonnes, due to better crop. In the US, we forecast also a rise in export, and our number is currently at 62 million tonnes. It's a record, also a record level. But if we look at supply and demand in the US, we see that export availability is higher than this amount. This means that there is an increased potential for US exports if competitiveness of US maize improves. We also forecast a rise in export from Serbia, from Argentina, due to a recovery of their crops. In the EU, we forecast a small increase in exports. It's mainly from Romania and Bulgaria, due to a better crop and also due to their competitiveness. On the contrary, we forecast a fall in Russian export due to the collapse of harvest in that country. So if we put all our assumptions together, what does that mean in the main exporting countries? So here it's stock-to-use ratio in Ukraine, Brazil, Argentina, US and EU. As I said before, you see that stock-to-use ratio will remain quite low in Ukraine and also EU. This means just balanced situation. And just to remember that EU, it's a just balanced situation with 21 million tons of imports. On the contrary, here you've got South America with Brazil and Argentina. You see that the stock-to-use ratios should rise, even if there is some uncertainties about harvest, because we are far away from harvesting, as some crops have not already been sown yet. But the harvest meets our forecast. The situation should be quite comfortable. In the US, you see that stock-to-use ratios should decrease, but the situation should remain comfortable. And as explained before, export could be higher than what we currently forecast. If we look at stock-to-use ratio in main exporting countries, you see that we will remain at a really high level at the end of 18-19, with more than 25% of stock-to-use ratio. It's a really huge level. This means that even if we maximize the feed demand of maize, as I explained before, maize supply and demand will be quite comfortable. And this explains why maize has not followed wheat prices and barley prices. So this should pressure maize prices in the coming months. So here you've got a chart showing prices, and here it's our projection. So in red you've got US prices, which should remain flat due to the comfortable situation and the need for US to export large quantity of maize. In Ukraine and also EU Black Sea, situation is also less comfortable than the US. So we forecast a small recovery of prices, but they should remain quite low. Some swing factor that could change our forecast, and some factors to follow in the coming months. It's farmers' retention. So we, especially in the US, we saw in the past years that farmers' retention can prevent prices to decrease too much. Another factor is wheat prices rising more than expected, and then maize prices will have to follow. And the third one is a bad weather impacted maize in South America, Brazil and Argentina, in the months to come. So now, if we look more forward, we will present you our forecast for 1920. In terms of area, what we expect at the global level, it's a rise in area at plus 3% or plus 6 million hectares at the global level. So we forecast a rise in Black Sea country and mainly Russia. We also expect more wheat to be planted in the EU due to good competitiveness of wheat versus other crops, and also due to sowing issues of rapeseed these past weeks. There is some uncertainties on this number. As you know, it's quite dry, not only in France, but also in Germany, in Poland, in Central EU. So this has to be really closely monitored, and we will closely monitor that in the weeks to come. We also forecast a rise in US area, but it should be quite modest increase. With this assumption of plus 6 million hectares at the global level, production based on a trend yield should rise by 60 million tons. Of course, weather permitting.
So let's have a look to what could happen in 1920 for the wheat S&D. So the first thing is that you remember that we have seen that carrying stocks will be rather or even really low at the start of the marketing year in 1920, reflecting a tight situation, but we expect an increase in production that could even pull the production at a record high level, weather permitting, and if our assumptions regarding acreage materialize. The other point is that consumption could recover due to higher feed use, albeit to a lower level than what we had 2 and 3 years ago, but much ampler consumption than last year, or this year in what we forecast in 18-19. And regarding food demand, we also expect a much sharper increase in consumption for food and industrial demand than what we expect for 18-19. So all this together, with all these assumptions, we can see that we have an increasing carry-out stock by about 10 million tons. So it means that the situation could ease with a much less tight situation, but we do not expect to come back to the very, very heavy situation we had 2 and 3 years before. And looking at stock-to-use ratio for main exporting countries, so it is the same chart than before. For 1912, we see that this stock-to-use is increasing, not to a very high level, but it means that we should have a much more comfortable situation in 1920 that we had this year, or that we could have this year. Regarding prices, so prices there are US and French and Russian prices. We see that they could sag because of this increasing stock-to-use ratio, but without reaching the very, very low levels we reached when the prices were very depressed in 15, 16, 16, 17, because of this difference in stock-to-use ratio.
So now for maize, we see that the decline in stocks should carry on in 1920, even if we forecast a rise, quite a sharp rise in production. It's because feed demand and also human and industrial demand, global demand, should rise more than production. But here you see that stock-to-use ratio will decrease at the lowest level. Here it's a short history. But most of the decrease we forecast should happen in China. So if we look at main exporters' stock-to-use ratio, you see that we will remain in quite comfortable situation. This means that in terms of prices, maize will be pressured by this comfortable situation in main exporting countries. If we look on barley supply and demand for the next campaign, we forecast that stocks should bounce back compared to the low level we forecast for 18-19 due to a recovery in production thanks to a growing area. So if we look at stock-to-use ratio in main exporting countries, you see that we should recover from the low level of last year, but we will remain in quite a low level. This means that the barley situation for the next campaign will remain quite fragile. Then, the consequence on prices is we forecast a decrease in barley prices for the next campaign, but prices should remain high, at a high level compared to what we have observed in 1617.
Technical journalist from the Waddenbush Petit-Menier. I had a question. I think, maybe I'm wrong, I think you said that you underestimate demand on milling wheat. Which countries may have better demand than expected?
So, as I said, there's a situation rather complicated in many countries in the Middle East. So it's very difficult to estimate very precisely what will be the consumption. You know that how complicated is the situation in Yemen, but also in Libya, in Syria, in Venezuela, because of economic or even political crisis or whatever you call it. But so the situation is very complicated in these countries. It's difficult to assess if they will be able to import as much as needed for their, let's say, normal or trend consumption. So in several countries like that, let's say, for those countries as a whole, we think that we are rather underestimating if there is a bias, if there is something to adjust. We think that we should have to adjust higher rather than lower for this demand. What is interesting is that even if you put this figure on a rather low figure for food demand at a global level, you end up with a very tight situation. And so it means that even if we are underestimating this figure, we are ending up with a tight situation for the wheat situation.
So to conclude, it depends if the situation improves in this country, for instance, and that's why you understand.
If they are able to import, if they are able to bring the food until the needed in the locations where it is needed. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
To complement as well, maybe we have presented an increase in the world acreage by 6 million hectares, and we have explained that this will drive to a plus 60 million tons wheat production next season. It's of course because also behind this figure we are expecting yields to recover in some important countries. So this increase in acreage together combined with the increase in yield could bring a 60 million tons recovery in wheat production, weather permitting, of course. So I wanted to add this small compliment.
Thank you everybody for your attention. And here, just before leaving the floor to you, it's the name of all the analysts that contributed to this presentation. Thanks to them.